All right, my name is Randy Miller. I'm the Emergency Services Coordinator for Huron County. I run the emergency management and also run the 911 center. Welcome. I appreciate everybody being here today. A lot of the information that we're going to give out is hopefully going to be helpful to you, at least understanding what's going on with the water levels, the erosion levels, what we can and can't do about it, some of the laws and things that constrain what we can do about it. And at least at the end of the day, we hope you'll have enough knowledge to ask the right questions about how going about fix things. I'm a lot louder than most people. I spent 6 years in the Army getting screamed at, so I screamed back. Then I spent 15 years coaching football, so I know how to yell. Ask any official in Huron County, and they will tell you that I can talk louder than anybody. So, with that said, we're doing a couple things getting set up here. If you don't have an agenda, it's very simple. We're going to move along with what information that we have as we have it. We're going to start off with the weather service. Might as well start off with what's going to happen and figure it out and work from there. And then we'll move along to the Army Corps and Eagle, which, if you're not familiar with Eagle is, that's what used to be the DEQ. It's the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, now called Eagle. It used to be the DEQ. It's the same people doing the same, not necessarily the same people, it's the same purpose. And they do the permitting process along with the Army Corps. We're going to see if we can't get everybody all on the same page with that stuff. And then at the end, this is Lieutenant Convertis. He's from the Emergency Management and Homeland Security Division of the Michigan State Police. He's who we work with in emergency management to do declaration processes and that stuff. Lieutenant Convertis and I are going to try to explain how that works in some simple terms and not make it too complicated for you. And hopefully at the end of the day, that process won't be a mystery to you anymore. That said, we're going to turn it over to the weather service. As everybody comes up from these individual agents, they're going to introduce themselves. If you can't hear, please let us know. We'll try to get things a little bit louder for you. So with that said, we're going to start with the National Weather Service.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. My name is Brian Tilley, and I'm a meteorologist. Is that better? Yeah, so I'm a meteorologist from the National Weather Service in Detroit, Pontiac. Our office serves weather for southeast Michigan, and I'm going to go through some information here to kind of tell you where how we got to where we are now and what we might be able to expect moving forward. So yeah, there's my outline. I just have some information about the Weather Service, just some background on our agency. We're going to talk about precipitation trends over the last 5 years that kind of got us into this mess. And then we'll talk about some weather systems that affect the short-term, the undisturbed water level being at near records, and then what kinds of weather systems move through that can change that from day to day that you'll want to know about and keep track of. And then the watches, warnings, and advisories that we issue are designed to highlight those weather systems as they come through. And then at the very end, we'll talk about the long-range forecast for the spring and summer. So if you haven't heard of us, the National Weather Service is part of the federal government. Our parent agency is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and we're under the Department of Commerce. And our mission really is to kind of build the infrastructure for the weather enterprise for the country. We run all of the satellites and the computer simulations and take all the observations, collect all that data, and then make it available to the public, government agencies, private sector, the media. They all kind of build up off of that. You can see this patchwork of this map of the U.S. with this patchwork quilt of colors. These are all the local offices. There's 122 across the continental U.S., Alaska, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and we even have an office in Guam in West Pacific. Each of these local offices take care of the high impact weather that affects the local area. It's designed pretty much around the Doppler radar network that's spread out around the country. So for the Weather Service in Detroit, Pontiac, we have these southeast Michigan counties. There's 17 of them. Huron County, one of them. Our mission is to provide forecasts and routine daily forecasts, and then warnings for severe weather. Our office does marine forecasts for the open waters of Lake Huron all the way up to the bridge, and we do Lake St. Clair and the Michigan waters of Lake Erie. More about what we do if severe weather is hitting, and if there's going to be if there's a tornado or if there's severe thunderstorms. Those warnings come from our office from York County. During the winter, we issue all of the winter storm watches, winter storm warnings. We do hydrology for the inland rivers, and we have support behind the scenes to federal agencies, county emergency management, and like I said, the marine forecasts. We do fire weather, and we have we collect all of the surface observations around southeast Michigan. We launch weather balloons from our office twice a day, every day. Our office is 24/7, so we're there around the clock. And so if there's anything going on that's high impact weather, we're on duty to detect it and let you know. Okay, so what we're going to do here is take a look at statewide precipitation rankings over the last 5 years or so. This kind of outlines why the Great Lakes have risen to record levels over the last few years. It wasn't that long ago we were near record lows, and this map shows from June of 18 to May of 19 that we had the third wettest one-year period out of 124 years. And so that's versus all one-year time spans that's in our climate database for 124 years of data. And here's a 3-year time span, June 2016 to May 2019. Again, this is actually a record wettest for that 3-year time span compared to all 3-year time spans in our database. And again, I'd like to point out that all of the surrounding states are at a record for precipitation amounts on average over those states for that time period. And where does all that water go? Into the Great Lakes. And you can imagine that, you know, the runoff, the actual catch basin for the Great Lakes is kind of small when you consider the size, the aerial coverage of all the lakes combined. But northern, or that part of Ontario that goes around the east and north part was equally wet. And so you can kind of see that all this precipitation that we've been getting has just been going right into the lakes, Lake Superior and then Lake Michigan Huron. And then this is a 5-year time span from June of 14 to May of 19. This is versus all 5-year time spans, June through May. Again, for that whole 5-year period, it's a record for the greatest amount of precipitation in all 5-year time spans that we have in our database. And my colleague put these slides together last summer, so you might be wondering, well, what happened since May of 19? And this is a statewide precipitation rank for July through December, which is basically the second half of last year. And we ranked 122 out of 125. So that was 4th place out of 125. So again, we've been, for the last part of the year, we've still been way above normal on precipitation. And then just to top it off, for the month of January of 2020, we're still much above average. We're ranked 110 out of 126, which is 16th place out of all of our whole climate database. You might remember in the middle of January, we actually had 2 or 3 inches of rain over southern part of lower Michigan. And that's just indicative of the way above normal precipitation amounts we've been getting over the last 5 years. So that precipitation record over the last 5 years has kind of brought the average water level up to records. And then as the seasons progress, there's a seasonal variation in the water levels it's governed by really what really drives it is in our friends at the Army Corps of Engineers did this slide, and it illustrates it really nicely. Really what happens is that during the summer, there's relatively low precipitation amounts because it's all about thunderstorms and they're not quite as widespread. The lakes warm up, and then the lake water gets nice and warm. We get into the fall and into the winter, and there's a bunch of evaporation, and that gets the seasonal decline going. And then in the spring, we have snow melt, and then the spring rains, and it gets us going back up again. And so we have this variation from season to season for the undisturbed water level. And that is really kind of on the backdrop of the record highs. So what our job is going to be going forward is to let you know when the undisturbed water level is going to become unusually high or unusually low. And I've just got a few slides here that show the kinds of weather systems that can impact water level significantly over the course of a day or even a few hours. And that's really like low pressure systems that have really strong wind, kind of like what we've had the last couple days. Fortunately, they were kind of from the west this time around, and so it's at least not coming straight down from Lake Huron, from central Lake Huron. Thunderstorms, they can move through and they can be really well organized, like what this radar picture shows. This is a picture of Ludington, and you can see the pier is pretty much submerged there. And that's what we call like a medio tsunami or a sage, that the thunderstorms come across the lake and they push the water up against the downwind shore. Low pressure systems. This is a picture of Superstorm Sandy. This storm produced 75-mile-an-hour wind gusts over the southern part of Lake Huron. Fortunately, that happened when we were at the record low water levels. But a storm like this coming through would be something that we would be highlighting in our forecast. We would be issuing watches and warnings for lakeshore flooding that would be a result of something like this. This is a time graph. It's kind of noisy, but it kind of shows where or how thunderstorms can affect the water level over a short period of time. This is a storm that came through, and you can see the peaks here and here. 4-inch difference when you have water levels like they are now doesn't seem like much, but when you add the waves and everything to go along with it, it can be pretty destructive. This is a storm that we had during the Jobby Nooner on Lake St. Clair. You can kind of see this is just a couple hours of time, and from this is like 1600, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 p.m., 8 p.m. The storms came through and made a pretty dramatic increase in water levels over just a few minutes. And the same thing happened here at Windmill Point. Now, thunderstorms produce changes in water levels over a really quick time period and can be really high amplitude. What we call a seiche is a little bit more of it's a longer period of time. It happens more often on Lake Erie. It's like a long bathtub, and the storms can come through and push the water all the way over to Buffalo. It has to go back somewhere. So it comes back and it'll go up again at Toledo and back and forth, and it takes probably about 12 to 24 hours for that to occur. But the water level changes there can be on the order of 5 or 6 feet. And so those are things that are a little bit longer progressing in time, but can still have significant impacts when lake levels are at record highs. And this is a water level trace at Toledo, and you can see here where there was a beginning of a seiche, and it took the water level up. That's it's 2.5 feet right there. And then it comes, you can see it comes up on the west end, and then it goes back down below, and then eventually settles into an average level. But these are 12-hour time periods. This is between this trough, this peak, and this trough, that's 24 hours. So it's a longer progression, but it's equally high on the impact of water level change. So again, when the undisturbed water level is at record highs, our goal is to let you know when there's going to be substantial changes due to short-term weather fluctuations, high-impact weather that could make things even worse, even if it's for a short period of time. So we issue a flood watch that can be 1 to 3 days ahead of a major event. Then when we get closer, if we have high confidence that there's going to be a real serious impact, we can issue a warning that would be over the next 1 to 2 days. And then if it's going to be a little bit less impact, then we can just have an advisory out, which is, those are kind of like the 3 levels of alertness that we want to get out to everybody. And St. Clair River has a lot of issues these days. It's a little bit of a different application. So we issue flood warning and lines for just the St. Clair River. It's along the same lines. It could be for heavy rainfall, or it could be for ice jams, things like that can happen over the course of a couple days year round. Okay, so our spring outlook for this is from our Climate Prediction Center, and they update this graphic once a month on the 3rd Thursday of the month, and this is for March, April, and May. And typically you hear about El Nino or La Nina in the Great Lakes. That phenomena doesn't have a very widespread impact, with the exception of El Nino in the winter. It can give us a much milder winter, but other than that, if you hear about El Nino or La Nina and it's not wintertime, chances are it's going to be a very minimal effect on Great Lakes weather. So in the forecast from the Climate Prediction Center on El Nino is for a neutral pattern. El Nino is warmer than normal in the Pacific. La Nina is colder than normal, and their forecast is for it to be about neutral. So a low impact climate phenomenon is expected to be even more benign during this upcoming year. And so the long-term trend is more based on like the jet stream pattern, and that in turn affects temperatures. And so this up here at the top is the 3-month outlook for March, April, and May. And you can see in the Great Lakes we're slightly favored to be above normal on temperatures. Where it says EC, it's 50-50 chance of being normal. And then where the warm colors are, it's more confidence that they'll be above normal temperatures. And then the blue color is more confidence that they'll be below normal temperatures for that whole season. And then down at the bottom is precipitation. It works the same way. And the Great Lakes are in an area where that's just slightly favored to be above normal on precipitation. And you can see in the southwest it's below normal. The way that the shape of the orange colors, you can kind of imagine a low pressure system track moving along this type of an area. And typically when low pressure systems get east of the Rockies and into the mid-Mississippi Valley, they produce heavier precipitation down to the south, and then they kind of go up towards New York and the New England states. So that's what we're looking to possibly experience during the upcoming 3 months. If you want to keep track, there's a number here for precipitation For this climatology, we use 9.58 inches of precipitation. That's at Detroit. That's actually interpolated down to Detroit from a much larger area that covers the Great Lakes. So if you are, we would be looking to be, if we want to stay near or below normal, watch for 10-inch rainfall amounts over the course of that 3 months. If we can get below that, then that's kind of the benchmark that these outlooks are based on. And this is the latest outlook from the Corps of Engineers on the water level forecast for Lake Michigan and Huron. They're considered one lake, and we have, you can see the seasonal variation that we were talking about before. The blue line is what the normal level is supposed to be, and this is back in 2018. The red line is the observed, but you can kind of see that seasonal variation we were talking about from winter to summer back to winter. And over the last couple of years, the observed values have just been steadily increasing. And then over the last 6 months, you can see that we really didn't get we didn't really get much of a downward trend. There's a really the seasonal decline is really muted here, and that reflects the above normal precipitation that we've had into the inputs into the Great Lakes over the last 6 months. And compared to this dip here, you can see this observed dip is much flatter. And so compared to last year, here's where we were last January, and here's where we are this January. And then the forecast range is in this hatched area going through mid-July. The green line is the deterministic amount, and then there's like a probability spread that goes out above and below that to account for any changes or possibilities in above or below normal precipitation. So mid-July, that green line is at plus 58, and the latest water level for this past week for Lake Huron is plus 48. So the midpoint of that that green line is the midpoint in that range, and that's at plus 58 by mid-July. So that's our best estimate at this point, which goes up quite a bit compared to last year. And this is a picture of high water in Monroe County off the west end of Lake Erie that they've had recently from winds pushing the water over the Great Walls and getting into the neighborhoods down there. So it's happening all over the Great Lakes, and we're doing our best to try to assess the situation on short-term time frames to let you know when there's going to be substantial changes to what's already a difficult thing to manage. So that's a quick spiel. I went through that really fast. So if we want to back up and cover something else, or if there's any questions.
If you have any questions for the Weather Service, please just raise your hand and go ahead.
Hi, just wondering, people say the Mississippi River controls our lake levels. Is that true? Anything to do with the Mississippi River?
The question was, does the Mississippi River have anything to do with our lake levels?
I don't know. I'm not aware that there's much drainage at all into the Mississippi River. I think that there's a spot where water comes in actually at Chicago, and then at the west end of Lake Superior. But maybe there's someone here from the Corps that can speak to that.
So there's the Chicago diversion that flows out of Lake Michigan into the Mississippi River Basin, but that's the only place that water flows that's out of the Great Lakes toward the Mississippi.
Go ahead, sir.
On your last graph that you were speaking of, you were saying that the .58 and the .48, does that equate to these 10 inches of difference? Is that what that is?
The 10-inch rise this
10-inch
summer
rise,
compared
okay.
to last summer, compared to now.
Yes.
Right.
So,
Go ahead.
This is going to be covered a little bit again when the
Yeah,
Army Corps steps up, so.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah,
just so you know,
I'm gonna
we are
go
going to go
over
through
I'm
that
sorry if I
process.
stole
no,
your
that's
thunder.
okay.
I didn't know you were going to be here.
Yeah.
I was under the impression there wasn't going to be a presentation. So.
northeast wind, excuse me, northeast winds without precipitation seem to fill up the bay.
That's what we're talking about with the low pressure systems moving to our east. If there's a strong low pressure system with a lot of high wind that's coming down from central Lake Huron, that would be something that we would be notifying you about in advance before the winds develop, so that you can, and we would try to give you some idea of what the impact on the water levels.
Go ahead, sir. You're-
Yeah, do you have a graphic of when the water level was at the record lows, like in the 2013 and stuff? What was that?
I will have that in my.
You have that?
yes.
Okay.
Sir?
Yeah, in terms of the Great Lakes Basin or watershed, is there any impact on the rising ocean levels as far as groundwater underneath?
I think if we get to the Army Corps,
Yeah.
they're the experts on that. The Weather Service has got a different set of topics that they're kind of.
We're trying to figure out how much water is going to fall into the lakes.
Danny, go ahead.
On that note, there's a lot of precipitation that's been going on up north. It started in mid-October. They've had the second earliest snow season in history. How is that going to affect when the meltdown occurs, our levels of the precipitation that we're so-called expecting in the spring? Is that tied in with this too?
Why don't we do this? Let's transition here and we'll start moving forward in our presentation. Because these are, not that he couldn't answer some of those questions, but the Army Corps is actually prepared to do that between those, as we progress. And he'll stick around for a little while if you have questions for him, and we'll see how that goes. So let's step forward. Actually, we're going to go to Eagle next, if we could, because it's kind of a natural progression for some of the stuff we're going to talk about. And then the Army Corps, these guys, they got a lot of information that they'll give you at the end here. It'll all kind of tie together, and hopefully all the questions will be answered in the presentation.
We're getting it, hang on.
And
While Randy's pulling that up, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Brian Rudolph. I'm the District Supervisor for the Water Resources Division for Eagle, formerly DEQ, and we work out of the Bay City office. Hold on.
He locked himself up.
Somebody's convinced I can't operate this without a password, so they make me lock it. Rules. State government's not without rules. We have a lot of them. Sorry. Hey, okay, here we go. Okay, I'll do my best to outcompete Randy on the loud voice. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. All right, good. I've already told you who I am. I want to real quickly introduce the staff person from my office. Angie Cleary is in the back. She actually is responsible for Huron County, so if you call our office, want to speak to the person who directly deals with Huron County, that's going to be Angie. I'll also point out Mark Lisinski from the Army Corps of Engineers, who also does the permitting for the Corps for this area. And we'll get back and forth into questions on permitting. We'll probably go back and forth on it, so just so you know. This is a map of the entire state. Our office covers everything from just north of Port Huron all the way up and around the bay and then over into Clare. Here's contact information. There's also some up here. If you didn't get this, feel free to grab some on your way out or just write down our numbers. I'll give you all a second to do that if you want. Okay, this is going to be a pretty brief overview on what Eagle is doing to try and help speed the process along. There are some things on here that the Corps is going to handle much better because I'm no expert, so I'm going to skip right on by it so we can get to the experts on it. But basically, we all know why we're here. Water levels are cyclical. We've gone from record lows, record highs, and record times since 2013, and we got to figure out how to handle it now. So all of our Great Lakes are high. That's no surprise. I'm not even going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about this because when you're coming to us or you're coming to talk to Mark, we have to address the nuts and bolts of the situation, and that's how do you protect your house? How do you protect your structure? What's going to work best? And that really depends on the geology of where you're at. You know, it's going to be one thing if you're on Sand Point, it's something entirely different if you're up at Grindstone, right? So we have to look at, and really your contractors should be looking at, where are you? Are you on a bluff? Are you down in a floodplain on the river? Are you on a coastal wetland, dunes, whatever? Always going to be a little different. I'll say this multiple times, all of your properties are a little bit different, right? What works for one may not work for somewhere else. You got a little bit angle change on the shoreline, so we take this into effect, and you should too. We all know there's been a lot of risk. We all know the last 2 or 3 years, we just keep watching the water come up and up. Really, this last year is when it got everybody's attention. It really got everybody's attention on the west side of the state. But we know it's been going on over here too, and we've seen it in the bay quite a bit. So our role specifically is to help in the permitting process to mitigate the damage that's going on. We got to fix the problem so we're not losing houses. That's not me. So this is what we're seeing. Now this is on the west side. I have you have some other more local ones, but we've seen a lot of this, right? Structures, old structures have failed. This one I think has been on the news everywhere.
Yeah.
This is pretty common. We see this a lot. This is over Aranac County. It's getting real close to somebody's house. Structure's being threatened. Not much left of the structure now. And now it's getting real close too. This is Iosco County. Everybody talks about high sand dunes, but we still have them over on this side of the state too. You go down around Lexington, you see a lot. So we see the same kind of trouble, same kind of problems. Structure's just getting left out because everything's eroding around it. This is another one. I don't know if you can see that all the way in the back. That's a septic tank. That's bad. What I want, this is really hard to see and I apologize for that, but this white tube here is a drain tile. And if you live on any sort of a shoreline where you've got any bit of a bluff, if your storm drains, if your French drains around your house, if your guttering runs down into the ground and then goes out to the shoreline, it's just another added source of erosion, right? So you need to give some consideration as to whether or not you want that to continue. Because you got water coming out, that's eroding down. You got the waves coming in, that's eroding out. So you're just kind of compounding the problem. And we haven't really talked too much about it, but it really is another thing you can pretty easily take care of. So kind of keep that in mind. Let's talk a little bit about permitting. Last year, 2019, our department under Part 325, which is the part of Public Act 451 that regulates activities along the shoreline, we issued 730 permits. In the last 3 months, we've issued 500.
Wow.
So there's a lot of work going on, and we're really working hard to move them through as quick as we can. So what does that mean? What are we doing? Everybody asks, well, what are you doing? Well, the best thing we can do is help move you through the process as quickly as we can. Like I say, we did about 500 so far. One of the reasons we can do that is because we've changed our processes. We're expediting permits, moving them through the process as quickly as we can. We're finding new ways and better ways to help you folks when you have questions. We're getting out and talking to people as much as we can. That's just another way of saying I'm here. What does all this mean? What we had to do is we started getting so much work coming in, we sat down, we came up with a prioritization tool to figure out how we're going to look at these. You get in 30 applications come into my office in one day. Some of them are threatening a home, some of them are threatening a dock, some of them are threatening a deck, boathouse, whatever. Some of them are trees. And trees are just as important to somebody as anything else, but they're not as important as somebody's house, right? So when they come in, just so you know, we go through those stacks and we look at it and we prioritize it. Is it critical infrastructure that's threatened? That goes at the top. Is it your home? That goes at the top. Then we start working our way down. Is it a dock? Is it a deck? Is it, and sometimes you have public walkways along the shoreline. So the important thing to take away from that is your application isn't just sitting in a pile under somebody else's that's just worried about a tree. And I'm not diminishing your trees. Just houses are more important. So we've done that, and that's been a big help. We've really moved a lot of stuff through. We've reassigned staff statewide to work on just shoreline work. The governor has been kind enough to authorize overtime, so we can do that. We're exercising emergency permitting authority along the Great Lakes, which is something that up until last year we really hadn't done. We're starting to develop some new criteria for minor projects that are really sort of a stopgap, very temporary measures, and the one that we've just done is for sandbags. The idea here is it's to be pretty small. I'll show a picture of it in a minute, but there may be scenarios where you need to put in sandbags. We're talking small sandbags, but it's a temporary fix. And I'm not going to talk about critical dunes because they're all on the other side of the state. Where do you get all this information? The best place is this webpage right here. Michigan.gov/high water. Excuse me, there goes my voice. The third one of these we've done in the last 3 days. Michigan.gov high water has got links to just about everything that you need to know, including links to the Corps pages and everything else. Highly encourage you to go there. Get out of the way. Sorry, folks, I know you're trying to see too. And take a look at this webpage. These handouts actually come from there, and they also have links that you can get on those as well. This 800 number, you can call during the day if you've got questions. You need to talk to people on a call center. One of the other things we did is set up a special call center just to take calls on Great Lakes issues. So, if you call and you need to talk to somebody about a Great Lakes problem, tell them that's what you're calling for. Because otherwise they're going to go through this whole question and answer about is it an oil spill, is it, whatever. Tell them right up front, calling about high water. And again, we're communicating as best we can. We're getting the message out as best we can all over. We're trying to look at some efforts to do some additional mapping, working with other agencies to try and identify areas that possibly are not threatened right now, but have a high probability of such in the future, because we've got to somehow get ahead of this. We're reacting as best we can, but we need to be a little bit ahead of the game as we move forward. We're working with municipalities, because municipalities have to recognize that things like wastewater treatment plants now have problems, because trying to get flows out from there, that's a problem. Working with drain commissioners, because if you talk to any of your drain commissioners, I know I saw Gary, there's Gary, he'll tell you that water can't go anywhere, right? So we're working with drain commissioners, trying to figure out that, to do some emergency preparedness. And holding as many of these kind of meetings as possible. I'm going to quick go through about 4 or 5 questions that everybody asks, and hopefully I can answer some of yours real quick. I think we all know permits are required, because it just beat it to death with how fast we're trying to get them done. When you do need permits, it comes from us. When you apply, permit comes into us online, we immediately send it to the Corps. So you only apply for 1 permit. If you didn't know that, it's not 2 permits. Well, you get 2 permits, but it's 1 application. It comes to us, we send it to the Corps, we both look at it, you'll end up with 2 permits. Again, critical dunes are not here. Please be sure and check with your local folks, especially your soil erosion folks. They probably have requirements under Part 91 that you want to check on. How do I begin the process? Find a good contractor. That's the first thing we're telling everybody. And that's not all that easy to do right now because there aren't all that many contractors in some parts of the state that can do the work. But one of the best things you can do and most important things you can do is find a contractor who's been doing the work, who knows how to do the work, and understands your area. Because again, you got to know what's going to work here as opposed to what's going to work somewhere else. And I know I recognize a couple of contractors here today, and that's good. So find a good contractor, start talking to them, get their advice and input. You know, whether you have them do the application or you do the application doesn't matter to us at all. But please do stay in communication with your contractor. They're so busy right now that you'll talk to them 1 week and they'll be ready to get your application in, but they're also busy trying to get other people's places fixed. So stay in communication. If it seems like your application isn't moving fast enough, let's make sure there's not a glitch somewhere between you or the contractor or my folks or something just got lost in the ether on the internet. Because I had that conversation this morning with somebody.
Do you work directly with the contractor? I know you're here.
I'm sorry, what was
Do
that?
you work directly with the contractor?
Do we talk directly to them? Absolutely, all the time.
Okay.
You bet. What's the best design? It depends. You get a lot of seawalls, you get a lot of rock riprap. You go up by Iosco County, you get a lot of rock cribs. It really varies depending on your site, depending on what's going on with your piece of property, and that's why talking to an experienced contractor makes a big difference. Because you don't want to end up in the, I'm going to run through a couple of quick scenarios. What you don't want to do, and I've had these conversations with folks, is invest $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 into something that's going to fail in 6 months. You put it in the spring, big storm comes up in October, and all of a sudden you're trying to figure out what to do. These are giant sandbags that got put at the toe of this bluff. That's what's left of them 2 months later. This is a yard fence. I mean, that is not going to work, right? I mean, bless their heart, they're trying, but that's not going to hold up. These are Jersey barriers. These are the traffic type barriers that we see, and I know these are a very attractive option for some folks because they go, well, geez, they're big. Brian, they're big, they're heavy, they're not going to move. I'm going to tell you they're going to move. There's a reason they're going to move. They don't, I mean, think about it. It's just a big Lego, right? You're just sitting it on the sand. So it's going to wash out. It's going to move. It's not going to stabilize your shoreline. It's not like rock. It's not like big riprap. That stuff locks together. These don't. So these are already moving here. Gabion baskets. We're starting to get a lot of questions about folks wanting to use gabion baskets. These are basically really heavy-duty chicken wire filled with rock. These aren't a great option. I'm not going to say they don't work. I know that sometimes stuff works at some places and people will swear it's been there for 70 years. May have. But as a rule, what ends up happening is what you see here. These were installed 5 weeks before this photo was taken. They're already starting to pull apart and get dragged out. So I'm pretty confident, this was last fall, I'm pretty confident this spring they're going to be beat right to death by ice. So these aren't a great option. We try to discourage this, but it's not to say if you're really convinced, we'll listen to your argument on it, but this is why we don't like it. This contraption is something called a trap bag. We have not seen these, and I put this up mostly in case you have seen these, and if you have, come and talk to us. It's one long, continuous, sort of a centipede type style sandbag. So it's not quite like the ones I showed you earlier where they just kind of go to pieces. This is on the west side of the state. They've used it a little bit. I don't have any good experience with it. We haven't had any contractors use it. So if you have a contractor that wants to use it, have them call our office and let's have a conversation about that to make sure it's going to work for your site. Cora's going to talk about that. Shore protect's expensive. What else can you do? We keep telling folks you can move your house. Yep. That is an option. It's kind of a heck of a thing for us to tell folks that, right? Because it's not an easy thing. There may be some sites where there's not a lot else you can do, especially some of the sites where there's on really high bluffs. But that's not really the case so much for us over here. I don't know that this is really a problem. It could be, and maybe in some cases you have to look at that. The sandbag thing I was telling you about, the minor projects, are they an option? Yes and no. You can use them as a very temporary stopgap measure. We have a minor project category that was just developed for this. The expectation is that it's very temporary. You're gonna put it in, you know, your contractor can't get there till Monday, it's Friday, you're really concerned, you wanna get this stuff in. Because in all honesty, they're not gonna last very long. But we're trying to come up with options that work for folks as best as we're able. It's a bigger version of them. They're still in place. They seem to be doing okay right now. Some of the tough questions. My house falls in the lake. Who's responsible for it? Well, unfortunately you are. Just like I am if something happens on my property. I think we all understand that. We hope that doesn't happen over here. We haven't seen a lot of it. So we're going to cross our fingers and hope for the best on that. Are we going to fine you if? We don't levy fines. Fines come from criminal prosecution or civil litigation. We do have portions of statute that say if you do the work without a permit, then the fee is doubled. Now, my wallet says that's a fine. I get it. But we have waived that process because of what's going on. So in the past, you've heard people talk about after-the-fact fees. We're waiving the after-the-fact fees. What we ask is, if you know you're going to be in a situation where you cannot possibly get a permit fast enough and your contractor can somehow be there quick enough, pick up the phone and call us so that we know. Let's make sure we're in communication, we know what's going on, and then we're comfortable with that. What we're not comfortable with is a contractor going out, or for that matter, a private citizen, and just building a bunch of stuff with nobody watching to make sure it's getting done right. Right? So just pick up the phone and call us. Why are we charging you to save your house? Well, we're not charging you to save your house, but state law does require permit fees. So that's not anything I have any control over. And why don't we just suspend the laws? Okay, I've gotten several calls from folks over here who are familiar with current litigation that's pending. I don't even know where it is in the process, but I know it's in the process. That would temporarily suspend state law or permitting, I think, for up to 18 months. I don't know where that is. I don't want to comment much about the bill itself, but I'll give you two things to keep in mind. One of the better reasons you want us to at least look at what's going on through the permit process is we've got experience in reviewing these projects. We don't want you to end up in those ones that fail, right? So I've been doing this 20 years, Mark's got 20 plus years. We've at least seen stuff that looks like it'll work and what won't work, and that's really part of what we're looking at. The other thing we're looking at is what you're going to do cause a problem for your neighbor? Because we don't want that either. So that's a real value to having us look at this and not suspend the statute. But the other thing is, even if you suspend it on the state side, you still got to get permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. So it doesn't make the permitting process go away. Is there funding help available? I'm going to let the emergency manager folks talk about that because that's really not our role. This information is available on that website. If you represent a community, a municipality, and you want to talk to them about getting some grant opportunities, you can call Rhonda Wychuck. She heads up our coastal division in Lansing. Again, I already showed this, but this 800 number and the Eagle Assist line for the call center can help you with questions. And this is our webpage. So this is where you should go.
662.
And if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can. I don't, but I'm not on Twitter. So And this is core information, so I'm gonna go ahead and that's it. Thank you for your time. I know it's crowded, and we really appreciate you coming out and taking the time. We hope we can answer your questions today.
What we'll do is we'll go through the Army Corps stuff, and then they'll be available for questions. I think that way, if the Army Corps covers what your question is, we can solve, get a little more expedited speed as well. So if you need to go, you can go and still get your seat.
Grab my 1980s computer.
All right, I'll get started so we can keep this moving and take time for questions. So my name is Deanna Apps. I work out of the Detroit District for the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm the lead forecaster for Great Lakes water levels, and I'll try to go through this. Some of this stuff was already covered, so I'll try to move through this fairly quickly here. I'd just like to start off with some notes about water levels. So they're measured as a surface elevation, so an elevation above sea level in reference to the International Great Lakes Datum of 1985. You'll hear me reference Michigan Huron as one lake because they're connected at the Straits of Mackinac. Hydraulically, we consider that one lake, so you'll hear me say Lake Michigan Huron. On our website, we calculate lake-wide daily means, and then those daily means are then calculated to lake-wide monthly means. Monthly mean water levels are the main statistic and water level we report out of our office, but we also have the daily means as well. Those water levels we try to base what we call based on still water, where they're not influenced by meteorological forcings. As the Weather Service pointed out, sometimes you get SAICH events and wind events that can cause water levels to rise and fall on opposite ends of the lake. So we try to use a network of gauges around the lake to calculate those lake-wide daily means. At the Detroit District, we are the keeper of really official monthly mean water level statistics. Up here it says 1918 to 2018. It's actually now 2019. We just finished coordinating data with Environment and Climate Change Canada. We work very closely with them. We coordinate a lot of our data products and our 6-month forecast. And as you'll hear me hit home in this presentation is that the primary drivers of water levels are the changing weather patterns and the resulting fluctuation of water supply. So I always like to start off too by showing just a map of the Great Lakes Basin and kind of what we're looking at when we're talking about the basin. So this image here on the right, everything that's highlighted in green there, we consider the Great Lakes Basin. As you can see, it's very, very large, covering over 14,000 miles of shoreline. Over here on the left is just a side profile view of the basin, kind of showing you how water flows through the system. So starting in Lake Superior, flows through the St. Mary's River into Lakes Michigan and Huron, through the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, through the Detroit River into Lake Erie, through the Niagara River over the Niagara Falls into Lake Ontario, and then eventually out through the St. Lawrence River into the Atlantic Ocean. So that's how water is flowing through the system. As I mentioned earlier, we do use a network of gauges on each of the lakes to calculate those daily lake-wide means. This graphic kind of gives you an idea. All the ones that are the bolded dots are the ones that are used in the calculation, and those cities are denoted here below. As you can see for Lake Michigan Huron, we have 2 over on Lake Michigan, 3 kind of covering the Lake Huron basin there. So, the blue dots are run on the U.S. side, they're run by NOAA, and the green dots are run on the Canadian side by the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I'm not going to stress this point too much, but as we know, high water is occurring. It's occurring throughout the basin. This picture on the top left is near Duluth, off Lake Superior. This one on the top right is from South Haven. You can see some shoreline flooding and erosion there. This bottom left one is off of Stony Point, Michigan, on the Lake Erie shoreline. And then up here, this flooding occurring in Oswego, New York, near the shoreline of Lake Ontario. So this is, complete Great Lakes wide event. So next I'm going to talk about some of the factors that impact water levels. What we call in our office, we call a term called net basin supply, which is highlighted in red there. And we consider net basin supply the amount of precipitation to the lake, runoff to the lake, and then evaporation off of the lake surface. That's what we call net basin supply. We also have to account for inflows from the upstream lake, so in Lake Michigan Huron case, the St. Mary's River, and then of course outflow as well, which in this case would be the St. Clair River. So I know that the Weather Service kind of covered this. I'm just going to briefly go through this. This time of year is kind of where we're, reaching our seasonal low, maybe beginning our seasonal rise as we get into early spring, and that's typically due to snow accumulation, typically a frozen ground, although that hasn't really happened this year. As we get into the spring and summer, we start to see water levels rise as we have increased rainfall, increased snow melt. So that snow melt does play a role in water levels rising in the spring. When we get to the summer, you have that increased sunshine really warming that lake surface, and that's going to play a big role come the fall when you start having that colder air moving over the warm surface water. That's really what induces evaporation, and that's really what is the main driver of lake level decline. Over these last 2 months in December and January, we had very warmer than normal temperatures in the region, which reduced evaporation and helped that decline be less than what it normally was. So here's, if you have one of the graphics that was up here on the table, this is our long-term hydrograph. I know back in the back of the room, especially you're not going to know numbers, and that's okay. I'm going to help point some stuff out here. So this is our long-term hydrograph. That blue line is the monthly mean water levels that go back to 1918 for each of the lakes. Lake Superior is on top, Michigan Huron is the second one, and then St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. That red line is the long-term average annual level. And as you can see, I like to use Lake Michigan Huron, which is that second chart here, as an example. You can see throughout this full period, there's been periods of high and low water. The most recent one, obviously in the late 1990s, we entered a period of low water, and we were in that period for about a decade until about 2013, 2014, and that's when we started to see water levels decline. Actually, in January of 2013, there was a record low on Lake Michigan Huron. Fast forward 7 years later, January 2020, we just hit a record high for the month of January. So in that period between 2013 and about 2015-16, we saw a very large rise in the lake, in lake levels that kind of that really kept steadily rising throughout the last several years. That has really culminated in some of these record highs lake levels that we've seen. So we did have record high monthly mean water levels in 2019. Lake Michigan Huron did not set a record in 2019 for monthly mean water levels, although it came very close in multiple months. In June and July, I believe it was within an inch, and in December of 2019, it was within an inch. As I just mentioned, though, in January 2020, provisional data does show that Lake Michigan Huron did set a record for the month of January last month. So you can see last year, due to some of those wet spring conditions, we did see records on Lake Superior, St. Clair, and Erie, and even Lake Ontario in June and July of last year. Records kind of continued into the fall through the September, and then the last 3 months of 2019, we didn't see any records on the lakes. And then, like I just said, in January 2020, we've seen a few records on the lakes as well. So I know the National Weather Service also talked about this, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but this is precipitation rank. This is actually for the Great Lakes Basin. Over the last 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, and 5 year periods, they've been the wettest on record in the Great Lakes Basin. And that's data all on the U.S. side. So we've seen a very persistent wet pattern over these last several years in the basin. And then this is just pointing out December and January basic conditions, so conditions so far this winter. So over here, the left diagram is December. This one here on the right is January. And you see those blue and greenish colors? Those are showing precipitation above normal. So you can see, especially the northern parts of the basin in December, definitely experienced above normal precipitation. And then again in January, a good amount of precipitation in the Lake St. Clair toward the Lake Huron Basin and even up toward the Lake Superior Basin as well. And then I'm going to talk about these two kind of separately, so if you kind of draw a line on here. So I'm going to talk about these graphics here on the left first. Those are stream flows, and stream flows are a good representation of runoff in the basin. And as you can see, we have our soils are very saturated right now. We're seeing very high river flows in the rivers across the state of Michigan. And you can see in December, these greens and blues and even blacks are showing above normal stream flow. And especially in January, this black is denoting very high stream flows, which is indicative of very high runoff in the basin, which we've seen these last 2 months. Then over here on the right, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen a very warmer than normal December and January, and that has really reduced the amount of evaporation that's taken place during a time of year when that really contributes to the lake level decline. So, Weather Service also kind of touched on these seasonal outlooks as well, especially the March, April, May, which is down here. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. We're looking at, and come the spring, we're looking at above normal temperatures and likely above normal precipitation. So next I'm going to jump into kind of our 6-month forecast here. I'm going to walk through this diagram a little bit, kind of tell you what some of these lines mean. So this red line that you're seeing, and I'm going to use this bottom one here. This is Lake Michigan Huron, and I think it's a little bit easier to see. So this red line here is the daily lake-wide mean level so far for 2020. The blue line is daily lake-wide levels from 2019. So that's comparing to last year. These pink dots in the middle represent your monthly mean water levels for the long-term average monthly means. And then these bars are representing record lows and record high water levels. So you can see for Lake Michigan Huron, we started the year well above 2019 levels. I believe that the January 2020 level was 18 inches above the January 2019 level. To give you kind of a reference point of kind of what this difference between level is. And then our forecasts are these green dots here, and the red bar that extends from that is representative of that 90% range. So if you have that other forecast graphic, that would represent that hatched region on that plot. And what you can see here is we're forecasting above record highs for the next 6 months on Lake Michigan Huron. We expect about, from the January monthly mean to the July monthly mean, we expected about a 9 to 10 inch rise over that time. We do these forecasts at the beginning of next month, so we are running our March forecast next week, so a lot of these numbers are going to change. However, given that we're tracking fairly close to our forecasted value for February, there's good indication that we will still be forecasting above record highs for the next 6 months. This is a similar graphic for Lake St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. As you can see, this is across really all the lakes. We're forecasting near above records, even on Lake Superior, which was on the last slide, and Lake St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. So as we go into these spring rises, we're going to likely continue to see high water. And this last thing I like to point out is we have a tool on our webpage which we call the Water Level Outlook. And this, we call it a scenario-based tool because it's not exactly a forecast, but it allows us to ask the question, what if? So what if we have another wet year of 2019? What does that look like? So I'm going to kind of walk through this a little bit. So this black line, these black dots here, again, are your long-term average monthly mean levels. These bars, again, represent record high, record low. This black line you can see here, this is the water level over the last about year or so, about 2 years. You can see again that small decline we had this year. And then you will come to a point. This orange graphic here, or the orange bar and line here, that's the 6-month forecast, which we just went over. This gray bar here, this is showing what we call the range of possible outcomes. So if you remember earlier, I talked about a term called net basin supply. That's your precipitation plus runoff minus your evaporation. We have net basin supply data that goes back to 1900s. We have about roughly close to 120 years worth of data. And what we do is we say, okay, if we run all those sequences of net basin supply through our routing model, what kind of water levels do we see given historical supplies to the lake? And that's what's represented by that gray band. So even if we see very dry conditions over the next year, we would follow the bottom of this range of possible outcomes. We're still going to be well above average. Obviously, we wouldn't be as close to records, but this is not something that's going to change quickly. We're still going to be well above average, even if dry scenarios occur. The green line toward the top here, toward the top of the range of possible outcomes, that would occur if we experience supplies near 2019. That green line represents the water supply from 2019. So that gives you an idea of kind of where we would be if we experience another very wet year as we saw in 2019. This last document here, this was in Brian's as well. This is Living on the Coast. There's some great information in there, and I'll let Jeff kind of talk about this a little bit more if you have questions on that. It has to do with how to protect your shoreline. And that's my contact information. That website at the top is our Great Lakes High Water webpage. That has a lot of great resources on it. Actually, that Living on the Coast is under the helpful link sources as well. And it has some frequently asked questions and contact information for all of our offices at the Corps. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and let him keep going.
Everybody, this is being recorded, and we are going to have a link to a website that you can actually see the whole recording, the whole presentation again. So if you missed something, don't get too worried about it.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff Yoakum. I'm also with the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm in our Emergency Management Department. I also work out of our Emergency Operations Center. Real quick with Living on the Coast, I'm also not going to talk too much about it because that's mostly erosion. Unfortunately, my department does not have any authority to deal with erosion. But you can find that either by clicking on the link, or if you just go to Google and Google Living on the Coast, there's a lot of really good information in there. Some folks looked at it last night during their meeting and they took a lot away from it. So anybody that's experiencing erosion, it's a very good document to look at. It is a few years old, but it's still applicable. Excuse me. Do I have a slide? I'm not going to use my slides. Mine are as cool as hers. I'm going to try to be real quick. So what my job is I'm essentially a liaison between the Army Corps, the state, the county, and the cities for what we can do to assist during any kind of emergency or natural disaster. Now we have two authorities that we operate under. The first one is the Stafford Act. I'm not going to go into that too much because that's FEMA type stuff, hurricanes, volcanoes. We get a volcano in Michigan, I'm quitting. So. The second one that we're kind of concerned about is Public Law 8499. So what Public Law 8499 does is it allows us to assist these folks and to some extent the communities without having any kind of presidential declaration or federal declaration. So under Public Law 8499, there's two types of assistance. The first type I'm going to cover just real quick is called direct. The reason I'm doing this one first is because that mostly applies to the state and to the county. What that would be is if we had anything that was considered critical public infrastructure, police station, fire station, wastewater treatment facility that was in danger of flooding, and the county or the city or the state did not have the supplies or equipment available to support, they can call us. If we have it, we can come in and help out. The only kind of caveat to that is whatever we give them, they got to give us back or pay for it. Good news is we're a little cheaper than if they went to Home Depot, so that's really more assistance for the city, county, and state for public infrastructure. The second type we offer is what's called technical assistance, and that's a little bit more where we're involved. So technical assistance, it essentially allows us to come in and meet with these folks, give them engineering advice. We can come out and take a look at some of their problem areas, tell them what we think their best solutions would be. We can take a look at any kind of structures they may already have in place and say, this works, this doesn't work, we recommend this, we recommend that. It also allows us to do things like flood fight / sandbag training. And you're probably telling me, well, Jeff, yeah, sandbags, put sand in them and throw them down. Not true. 6 years ago, I thought the same thing. There's a proper way to fill them, proper way to place them. The reason that we really kind of stress this is you folks that are experiencing any kind of flooding, we don't want you to go out there and do all this work for no reason. So one of the things that we really offer and kind of are stressing under technical assistance is to get with the counties and provide sandbag training classes. It's open to the public, we'll give demonstrations, we'll have folks participate. And the reason I say this is, we were with the community last summer, and we were providing technical assistance. They asked us to come out and kind of help out the community and take a look at their sandbag structures and whatnot. And we saw a lot of folks that went out and did the work like the city told them to do it, but they did it wrong. They built it on top of their seawalls, they built it on top of their decks. And that looks good, except for the water comes underneath it and goes behind it, so they did all that work for no reason. So if we can teach you folks how to do it the proper way, if you do have to sandbag, you do it right the first time, you don't have to do it again. Perfect example is, if you fill a sandbag all the way up, it's 70 pounds. You're only supposed to fill them 2/3 of the way. Second reason for doing that is, when you place them, if you place a full sandbag, you place another one extra on top of it, you're not gonna get a good seal. You do it 2/3, you place them on top of each other, sand settles, you get a better seal. So just little things like that allows us to help the agencies, to help the community. So, for example, we're currently involved with 13 counties in Michigan, providing either technical and/or direct assistance. We have 6 counties in Wisconsin, and I believe Duluth is about to apply as well. I mention those because our area of responsibility isn't just Michigan. We have all of Michigan, northern and northwestern Indiana, for the time being, eastern Wisconsin, and Duluth, Minnesota. So we're kind of busy, but we're out there. We're trying to help these folks. We're trying to help these folks help you. So that's kind of my quick spiel, and I'll be available for questions afterwards as well. Thank you.
So now we're going to open it up to questions for both Eagle and the Army Corps. So those questions you have, please proceed. Ma'am?
You said that you were gonna have a recording of this. How can we get that?
It's written up on the board up there. It'll be attached to that website. The gentleman's going to have it on the. It's kind of a local weather site that he has.
Can you print that bigger?
Yep. And on your way out, we can write it all down, and just anything that we have here, we'll make sure that it's published someplace where you get. It'll be on the Caseville Township site. We're going to have links. Trust me on some of the things. Go ahead, sir.
Anything to do with flood zones or floodplain, as far as whether the city is in one or people can apply themselves? Maybe that's coming up later.
Well, no, it's not. But the best thing I can tell you is if you want to find out if you're in a 100-year floodplain, if it's a mapped floodplain, you can go to the FEMA website and you can go to what's called the FIRM, Flood Insurance Rate Maps. You can actually create one for your community. You can go in, it's pretty simple. I worked my way through it, so I know it's not too hard. And you can find where you're located, and it'll show you if it's mapped. It is important to understand not all regulated floodplains and 100-year floodplains are mapped. So if you have a real question, you can call our office. We have a floodplain engineer that works at the state level, and she can
I
help
was
find
thinking
out.
about flood insurance, possibly.
Yeah, she can direct you to questions.
Sir, go ahead,
Good
sir.
question. So if you have an existing structure like a wall made of, say, wood or something that's kind of old, and you just want to repair that or fix it, do you need a permit? I mean, do you need to basically, some pieces of wood need to be replaced? Like go behind it, not in the water side, but behind it, put some more boards in. Is that, I mean,
If you are working on the landward side of an existing seawall,
yep.
and you're not placing more fill in front of it in the water, Brian and I discussed this, we're not requiring a permit because you're already working in an area that has been filled.
I think I talked to Brian last summer about this, and if I build a steel seawall behind, a foot behind my wood seawall, again, is a permit required?
It shouldn't be.
If you're on the landward side,
Okay.
the only thing that I would question a little bit is what we're starting to see, and I don't know if we're seeing it here, is that because of all the erosion, we're finding seawalls that were built in the 40s.
Ssure.
Maybe even buried.
Yeah, no.
So they're 50 feet out.
No, I
That's
just think
not where we're trying to
The
be.
question is now you're requiring, 8 to 12 feet of rock in front of the wall, which probably doubles or triples the expense of these walls now, so. And if I've got a wall that's there, why can't I just shore it up?
Yeah, well, there's a good reason that we're requiring the rock, and
But it kind of puts the economics a little further down the road for some people.
Yeah. So there was a period in time, and I'll let Mark talk about the before. There was a period of time that when we had low water and folks were putting in new seawalls, it was kind of a hard sell to say you got to put toe stone at the base of your wall, right?
Yep.
Because we tell people you got to do it to protect your wall. Well, the water was heck quarter mile out in some places. So what we're seeing though now is those walls that aren't protected are washing out and they're getting undermined. So we're taking a pretty hard line to say if you're gonna put in a new wall, you've gotta protect the toe, you've gotta put stone in front of it. How far out it goes really varies, right? Because it depends on how tall you put it.
Mhm.
So it's just a triangle. But you really do need it. We all understand it increases the cost. But just like I said before, you don't wanna spend $30,000 this year and then another $30,000 next year because it fails.
And
check question.
Yeah, I talked to you, we're on Lighthouse Road, and we've already sandbagged 3 times, and the erosion keeps figuring out. I have questions. How far the heck do we go? I mean, we're on our fourth.
This is you're on the lake side? Okay.
We can't hear the question.
Yeah, what was the question?
She's talking about sandbags. She lives over by Lighthouse Park, and she's sandbagged several times, and it's already washed away. And she's asking setback for the sandbags.
How far is your house from the lake?
I've lost 70 feet already.
Oh,
So
wow.
right now, I don't know, how far away are we from the lake? 40 feet.
40 feet, okay. What do you guys have between the house and lake? Is it just yard?
Yard.
Okay.
No.
I would pull them back as far as I could, and I'd try to protect the house to keep that water from hitting the house, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, on the lakes, guys, folks, when you're seeing these wave actions, the amount of sandbags you would need, as high as this wall as you would need to be to stop these wave actions, it's just honestly on the lakeside, it's not feasible. What you're trying to do is keep the water out of the house. If you're on a river or a canal, that's a different story, but on the lakeside, sandbags, to be honest with you, to keep the water in the lake aren't gonna work. But if you wanna use and protect your house and keep the water out of the house, that's what I would do.
My next question is there going to be any government assistance financially?
We'll cover that after we get the questions for there. That's a whole other section. We'll go through some of that stuff.
Can you give us a sense of what might be more effective in terms of a well-done rock barrier, riprap, as opposed to a well-done metal seawall?
both of them are gonna work equally well if they're constructed properly.
That's why I said well done.
Yeah, and
Because one is a lot cheaper than the other.
I'm aware of that. And it really, it comes down to personal preference of what you want to look at on the site, and the site, of course. But along this stretch, I haven't processed a lot of rock.
There's a lot of areas that rock alone, properly sized, we're not talking small, right? We've got a plan for large wave, you get a 7-foot wave, worst case, get a 7-foot wave coming in, you're looking at a 38-inch rock, right? So that's like this. Properly sized rock, properly bedded and installed, will hold most sites. I know we got some steel contractors in here who are gonna chase me down for that. I will say this, there are some sites where it may not be appropriate. You may need steel for some properties. And we recognize that. And that's where talking to a contractor who's familiar with your area is really critical.
Well, you said 38-inch rocks. My understanding was that a variety of sizes and not round ones is the ticket.
Well, yeah, not round. Typically, you're seeing quarried limestone is used.
Right.
We
But a
just
variety
thought-
of sizes, I believe,
A variety of
is also
sizes, but not
recommended.
small. Don't go down small. They're all gonna be pretty big.
Right.
Because small rock's just gonna wash right on out.
Thank you.
Man, she had her arm up over there, Shelley.
I just wanted to touch up on that question. I'm with Thomas Marine Incorporated, and we've done limestone jobs where we use large format limestone. Got some brochures back here. And a large format limestone, we're thinking that it's gonna hold better than the seawall. They haven't moved the jobs that we've done. They haven't moved at all, and it's much more environmentally friendly than putting a piece of steel in the water.
Question back here, go ahead, sir. Korea.
Yes, our property line is in the water, about 12 feet. And do you need a permit to fill in your own property?
Yes, you do,
Put in
because
stone.
you are still working in the lake.
Well-
Because you're working in the lake, you need a permit from the Corps and from Eagle.
But
Even
we're on
though
a
it's your
canal.
property.
We're on a canal and the lake, and that's where the water has eroded back onto our property, so that we got about 15 feet that's underwater.
Yes, sir. You
You still need a permit.
Yes,
sir.
you do.
You do it on your own property.
Yes. Just like if you're building a house or building a garage on your property, you need a building permit. It's your property, but there's still permits that are required to do the work.
Go ahead, sir.
Does that involve inspections? If you get a permit, do they come out and inspect it, or is it just a permit to do something?
Yes, we
We
do
do.
inspect them.
You do inspect it.
Yes, we do.
Mark does, Angie does.
I've noticed that this year there's been a lot less ice cover, and I don't know if that's consistent throughout the whole Michigan Huron system, but what's the net effect, or is that offset? Has the evaporation been greater because of the lack of ice cover? I noticed, I heard somebody say that, I think it was you that said that, you know, yes, we've had warmer than average temperatures, and that's reduced the amount of evaporation. I didn't quite understand that.
Yep. So, so two things there, really. So ice cover plays an interesting role because, you know, when ice forms, that creates it's through an evaporation process. Once ice forms, and you know, if you have a year where you get high ice cover, eventually once that ice cover forms, you know, you cease evaporation, but there's still a significant amount of evaporation that occurs in that ice formation process. This year, because the lakes have, you know, largely stayed open, it has been some evaporation, but because the temperatures have been warmer than normal, it hasn't been as much as it typically would. And so we've seen reduced evaporation, because what really in evaporation it really works opposite of kind of what you would think in your head. It's opposite. It's really the water that's warm and the cold air moving over it, which induces significant evaporation. So when you get like those really cold events in like October, November, those really create a significant amount of evaporation because the waters are still relatively warm from the summer, and you get a large amount of evaporation. So it almost kind of works maybe opposite of what you would naturally think it would.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, you've stated that we've got a lot of monthly records, right? We've been setting monthly records every month, but we still haven't gotten to the all-time record, right? We're still like 12 inches under that.
I'm not sure exactly how many inches. The all-time high in our period of record that starts in 1918 is October 86. That is the highest monthly mean for all months. I can't tell you close to how many inches we're below that right now. But
if my math was right, it was 12 inches and 12 1/8 inches from your February 21st to the high mark.
I believe that the October, and without numbers in front of me, the October monthly mean level is about 582.3 something feet. We're at about 581.56 feet. That gives you kind of an idea of how far. So we're still, you know, less than a foot. But I know that our forecast that we put out in February, even that forecast for that July level is still below that October record high.
Right, and another question, how come you only go back to 1918, you said you went back to?
Yeah, 1918 is when we started using a network of gauges to calculate the lake-wide daily means. So there is, data that goes back further using like one gauge, like a master gauge.
Right, okay.
So we do have that data available to us, but because it's only calculated using one gauge, we don't include that in the period of record.
Right, and back in 1889, the lake was even another foot higher than it is at the highest level it's ever been. So in 89 or
Okay.
86.
Yeah, like I said, without numbers in front of me, I'm not sure exactly on that, but there is definitely data available back into the mid 1800s.
And the outflow and inflow is only rain participation or rain and evaporation.
So there's inflows. So there's precipitation and runoff, which,
Okay.
and then evaporation is almost a negative, that because that's coming off
Right.
of the lake surface. And then we do have to account from inflows from the upstream lake. So your inflow from in Lake Michigan or from St. Mary's River, and then your outflow through the St. Clair River. So those are all factors that would impact the water level.
You don't count the inflow from Lake Superior and the inflow north of Lake Superior?
So the inflow from Lake Superior would be through the St. Mary's River.
Okay.
So the St. Mary's River is connecting Lake Superior to Lake Michigan Huron.
And do we count up farther into Canada where they've diverted a bunch of water down here?
So the diversions that flow into Lake Superior would be part of the impact to Lake Superior's water level.
Okay.
Because that's their inflow from.
But we don't count that as Lake Michigan and Huron.
Well,
Just like you're
eventually, so remember the water is flowing through the system. So
Right.
water that flows in through that diversion through Lake Superior through the St. Mary's River, eventually it would reach Lake Michigan Huron, but it's not a direct impact to the Lake Michigan Huron water level. That's something farther upstream of that.
Can it be manipulated through the locks?
So, through the St. Mary's River, there is a Plan 2012 is in place. That is run through the Lake Superior Board of Control through the authority of the International Joint Commission. Out of our office, we support that Board of Control, but ultimately the decision on, there's compensating works there, there's SULOCs, there's hydropower, so there's several areas where that flow goes. Through several gates and to hydropower and municipal and industrial uses for that water. That plan accounts for all of those things. It accounts for hydropower, it accounts, takes into account the Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Huron level, and it tries to balance those impacts in those regions, and that's how they determine a flow. We provide a recommendation to the board, and then the International Joint Commission is really the final decision of what that gate setting is that determines the flow through the St. Mary's River.
So if it gets real high in Lake Superior, can they manipulate and let more water downstream just to relieve Lake Superior?
So that's why there's a plan in place, because it tries to balance those impacts. Because
Does
it wants
somebody
it.
monitor that?
So it's monitored through the International Joint Commission and the Lake Superior Board of Control. The Board of Control, the Army Corps, we sit on the board, as well as the Environment and Climate Change Canada. We each have board members that help support the Board of Control, and that's all run through the authority by the International Joint Commission. And so, like I said, the plan that is put in place, it has, goes through many studies. A lot of scientists are involved in that creation of the plan, because we do want to take into account both, the Lake Superior Basin and Lake Michigan Huron Basin, and things that are occurring on both sides of that flow.
Are there adjustments made in different years at all?
Yep, so depending on the basin conditions in a given year, all that gets taken into account. That plan is run at the beginning of each month with our forecast. So at the beginning of each month, they're determining a new flow that goes through the St. Mary's River.
Can you give us the cliff notes of that whole scenario? Because there's several checks and balances with inflow and outflow from Canada's dumping 2.6 billion gallons of water a day for their hydropower, which they need. I'm not getting on them, but, you know, and then from there, we've got the locks, like you said, and there's several. Could you give us the clip notes on that?
So, the two diversions that flow into Lake Superior, those are both run by, on the Ontario side of the border. They have, the inflow is very minimal. Even if we just ran an analysis in our office, even if we close those diversions off for 1 year, the impact on Lake Michigan Huron water level would be 1 centimeter.
Okay.
So, it would be 4 centimeters on Lake Superior. So even, you know, trying to take those measures there, it's really not going to impact water levels that much. The ability that you know, from as far as the St. Mary's River point of view goes, yes, there is a plan there in place that regulates outflows, but it is not in place to regulate lake level. So that's a big point. Yes, we can regulate an outflow, but we can't regulate lake level. Lake levels are largely determined by Mother Nature.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we're in a persistent wet pattern, and precipitation and runoff have been high for several years, and that's what's really causing these issues now.
We had a question over here, Greg.
I did. Mine changes direction a little bit here, but it's in point. It's for the Corps of Engineers. I read the budget from this administration going forward. It looks like massive cuts to the Corps. Looks like massive cuts to the Corps. Tell me I'm wrong.
I don't have the answer to that, to be honest with you. I wish I did.
It's a proposed budget.
And it could very well be. That's way above my pay grade, if that's going on. So I know that's not the answer you want. I really wish I had a better answer for you.
Gentleman over here in Michigan had a question.
I got a question. Back in 2013, when we had this low water, well, we had high water, then we had the low water. Okay, this newscaster come on TV, and he said, well, that's when the lakes fell 3 feet in 1 year. He come on there and he said, well, the lakes went down because of evaporation. Now, how can it be evaporated? You got big lakes here. In 1 year, 3 feet. Second question is there a gate down there by Niagara Falls that's holding this water back?
So, I'll address the first question. So, yes, we were in a record low. I don't know exactly how many feet we dropped from the late 90s into, you know, it very well could be 3 feet. So during low water, that was the consensus that evaporation was a lot of the main cause. We did see especially a lot of cold winters during that time. And like I said, that cold fall and early winter does drive evaporation, and that can cause your seasonal declines for several years to be much greater than they typically would, which would keep water levels lower. So evaporation did play a decent role in that. Also, it also matters kind of what happens in the spring. If the spring rise, like if you get less precipitation and less melt in the springtime, then your rise isn't going to be as high as it normally would, and then that also, so it's kind of a combination of high evaporation during that fall and early winter, and then maybe less of a spring rise during when we would see increased rainfall when we're maybe seeing less rainfall. So it's kind of a combination of large declines and decreased seasonal rises. And then, sorry, what was your second question?
There's a gate down there by Niagara Falls, but raise and lower.
So the flow out of Lake Erie into Lake Ontario through the Niagara River is completely natural. It's a natural flow. There is a Lake Erie Board of Control that pretty much manipulates, watches and monitors flow over the falls and flow upstream of the falls, and there is hydropower there, but it doesn't affect the total flow through the Niagara River. So there is nothing there that is holding back any of the water.
Go ahead, sir.
I got two questions. First, you referenced 8499, section 8499.
Yes.
Especially the technical assistance part. Now, I haven't read it in a long time, but I thought that when you start talking about the multiple permits you have to have, that there's a way that they can be combined considering that this is truly a technical assistance issue, working with the state and working with the county, is that been explored by anyone? And if not, can that be looked into? Because again, you know, the one permit, obviously, between the Corps of Engineers and state, that's a single one. You got the one from the county as well. The more you consolidate this, I think the more folks are gonna look at something that needs to be done. Because I agree, you can't get rid of permits, you gotta have them. But that process should be able to be streamlined in some different way. Has that ever been explored? Art, you know anything about that?
I don't think we have looked at getting involved with the county in the permitting aspects. We have the joint application. We're working very closely with DEQ, Eagle, or what they will be called next week.
Who knows?
But no, but what's the idea, you know, with the Corps permit, the state permit, and local permits is the permits that are locally driven are people that are in your same area that will have same concerns as you. Our program is a nationwide program. To get involved at that level, I'm not sure how we would go about it because well, we're still having growing pains with the state, and we've been doing it.
Let's get the question over to that for the DNR, DEQ, Eagle. In regards to, you made a statement, which I agree with you 100%. You always have to look at what impacts are being made. We happened with next to an easement, and on the other side of the easement, our neighbors are getting a seawall coming in hopefully springtime. But we have this easement, and they will not put a seawall in, which means it's going to create all sorts of problems with water rising up. Is there anything on the books for the state that talks in terms of looking at those types of issues where a particular property owner, or in this case property owners, are putting their neighbors at risk because they're refusing to hold back the watershed?
So, with respect to an easement where there is no development, I don't know of it. Now, we do get questions a lot where one neighbor has a failing structure and it's right next to yours, and you're concerned it's gonna cause negative impact on yours. The Michigan Building Code has a provision that's administered by the county that you are responsible to maintain structures on your property. But that's a county level ordinance that has to be handled through the building code. It doesn't, no, it says structures, so shoreline protection structures, we've referenced that a lot to the folks that come. Yeah, as far as the authority that we have, I don't know if there are other laws.
Canada actually mandated everything. We can't hear the question.
What they're talking about is what happens if your neighbor, if you do all the work and your neighbor doesn't? Is there something in place that allows the state to do something to make your neighbor do something too? So if you're protecting your property and they don't protect yours and it undermines your efforts, the basic question was, is there anything in place at the state level that can touch that? And he basically said, not at the state level, although he referenced building code. If you can explain that probably better than I can, but.
Yeah, no, probably not. Your local building official can explain that better than Sir? Lieutenant Converse and I have a whole nother section to do. We're just trying to get the questions for these guys out of the way first, and we'll talk about that kind of in depth. Ma'am?
Do you have any information, what you mentioned is the exact opposite of what we're worried about? Both neighbors are putting in seawalls, we would prefer not to, and we're worried we're gonna be negatively affected by their seawalls. What's the data or experience with that situation?
You have an unprotected shoreline?
We've got a lot of rocks and we hope to put in more rocks, but just in general, you know, does somebody putting in a seawall and the other neighbor not wanting or being able to, are they likely to erode more with the seawall next door?
Not necessarily. You've got a
Okay.
hardened shoreline and it's protected. If it's holding and it doesn't get disturbed, then it shouldn't.
I got a question to follow up on that one. On the if you, like at our property, we keep the dune. We call it the dune grass. We like the dune out to the water. You know, we used to have hundreds of feet of it. And then you get down the beach, everybody's grooming their beach and flattening them out and stuff like that. Is that causing a problem too with high water?
Well, the activity of grooming isn't causing the problems with the high water. That's the high water, but you're removing a dune that is acting to protect your property.
Right, well, that's how the whole shoreline of the Great Lakes were dunes. I mean, I'm not talking about like Sleeping Bear dunes where they're, you know, miles high, but if you look at a map, like a satellite view of a map, you can see. Pardon me?
We're real familiar with shoreline grooming.
Okay.
All right, my question is there, we don't know what would work best in our particular spot. And, you know, you said start with the contractor. Of course, the contractor has their thing that they're doing, if they're, you know, whatever their specialty is. It seems like I would prefer is there a way to have somebody come out and say, okay, these things will work here, so we don't put in something that doesn't?
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't, you know, we only have 2 or 3 people that cover this whole shoreline. Yeah, we do have a process to do that. One thing I was looking at before I came here, there's a document that the Corps put out a long time ago that actually kind of gives pros and cons for a variety of different shoreline protection. It's a little dated, but what I was thinking I would do is just send you a link to it, and then if you want to contact Randy, you can take a look at it. It's sort of a best management guide, and it, like I say, it'll give you pros, cons, what is a good application for your shoreline.
Because we had something put in that didn't work, and now we have to do something again.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to talk to you. You can call our office anytime too.
Well, we had Mark come out, and we also had Mark, I believe that's your name, right?
Yep.
And also Teresa O'Brien from your office came out, and they both looked at our situation, said, okay, yeah, this'll work. And it was rocks, and it didn't work. No, they looked at the plan.
We absolutely.
Both the shoreline and the
And it was based on our experience, mine on both Lake Erie and Lake Huron for almost 30 years. It should have worked.
Well, maybe it was the contractor, but, you know, what'd be wonderful is if we could get somebody from either of the 2 offices to come out before the contractor and say, what we recommend is this, and then go with the contractor.
So we can give you some advice.
Right.
But there's a real fine line with a state agency mandating how you do it.
No, not mandating. Advice would be wonderful.
Right.
But it sounds like you only got 3 people.
There's different, some people are up on.
Got my dog.
And some people have a
Okay, we're gonna take one more question, and then we're gonna move on to the Public Act 390 stuff. And by all means, everybody will have the ability to ask more questions when we're done with that. We just wanna make sure, there's some people that I think want some answers that might have to leave. So go ahead back there.
My name is Brian Hacker. I'm with Eastern Michigan Contracting, some contractor. Just addressing there, I'm primarily from the commercial sector the last 15 years. And because I live in the area in Albany, that there's a lot of this going on, so I decided I would focus on residential for this year. And I give a full year guarantee on workmanship and materials for 1 year. You have to do that in the commercial sector, so I'm just extending that over into the residential in this situation here.
Ma'am, you had a question. Here.
Yes,
Go ahead.
you mentioned sandbag training. Is there anything scheduled for our area on that?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
Okay. No, we're gonna arrange a few things. This is a starting point for a lot of things, so we gotta start someplace, so.
Once the work under a permit is completed, is it necessary to notify Eagle and the Corps, and if so, how?
Our permits do ask that you let us know when the work is completed. You can call, you can send an email. Either way is fine. We're not picky.
And our permit has the final page of it before the drawings has a completion certification that you mail.
Oh, I missed that.
Okay. This part of it, we're gonna move on to the next part of this, and like I said, any questions you have, you'd be more willing to answer them after, so don't lose your questions if you still have them. But there's, like I said, the next section we wanna go to. What Lieutenant Convertis and I do is coordinate disaster stuff for different things. Under the law in the state of Michigan that covers that, Public Act 390, and it delineates what the governor can do, it delineates what I can do, delineates what anybody in between. And it's rather complicated, and some of the stuff that you saw handed out here on the table before that kind of goes through that stuff. So I'm going to let Lieutenant go quickly from the state view on down about that level from the governor's office backwards to us, and then I'll add in a little bit as we go past that level about what I do for you at this level. So,
Great,
Lieutenant?
thanks, Randy. Tim Kepvertis, State Police Emergency Management, Homeland Security Division. What Randy just mentioned is the Emergency Management Act is Public Act 390 of 1976. And that is our framework of how we respond as the state of Michigan, from the governor all the way down to your chief elected official, for a state of emergency or state of disaster. All emergencies or disasters in the state start locally and end locally. So there is a framework and a process, and Randy is going to be your first step in any type of declaration process. So what does that mean? Well, it gets a little bit complicated. The declaration process is based on damage assessment, how much damage do we have within that disaster, and resources. How much resources at the local level can help mitigate that disaster, how much resources at the county level, at the state level, and then the federal level is needed. So it is a process that we're going through. So that's the framework that we have to work into, and quite frankly, we've done it from 1976 as far as disasters that partner up with our non-Stafford or Stafford Act at the federal level. So when we're talking about shoreline erosion, it's kind of a little different type of emergency. We're used to emergencies that if a tornado comes through or a large flood comes through, it stops raining, we assess the damage, we talk to our homeowners, our business partners, we assess that damage, we tally a financial number to it, and then we start looking at the state level as, hey, is this too much economic impact at the local level? Can the state help out? If the governor so chooses to do that, we do the same thing at the state level. If the state looks at it and says, hey, this might be too big for the state of Michigan, then we are obligated, or the governor is, to go to the president and ask for a federal declaration. A lot of questions that came up is about funding. Is there any funding in the state for this? Under Public Act 390, for individual assistance, there is no funding. We do have a disaster emergency contingency fund under Public Act 390, but that is for our public entities. That's to pay our firefighters, our police officers, our DPW, our city, village, township, county, state workers to respond to that emergency and bounce back up, because we're always planning for the next disaster that may come down the road. So that's kind of the framework in the nutshell, how we work and how we do. Now, what the state of Michigan has been doing, we jumped into this high water mark back in March of 2019, last year. And what we're doing is we're working with our local emergency managers, all of them along our shoreline, the state of Michigan. We are collecting data. We need damaged homes, so we have a survey out there that all our locals use to gauge how many houses have been damaged, so endangered structures, and those are livable houses. Unfortunately, FEMA does not recognize shoreline erosion as damage. It's homes. It's not outbuildings, it's homes. So we're tracking that at this point in time all along our shoreline. We're also looking at public structures as well. We want to make sure that, hey, our roads are taken care of, our water treatment plants, our intakes, our wastewater treatment plants, anything that's going to impact all of us in our communities, We're making sure that those aren't gonna get damaged and those don't fail. So we're gauging and documenting that. So within MSP, we've mapped out our shorelines all over the state. We're comparing that data with data from back in the mid-'80s, the last time we had the high water mark, and we are just looking at that storm after storm after storm. What are we losing? We're documenting that. We need to build a case at the state level based on all of your information to possibly take that next step of a declaration if that comes. And again, it's based on damage. And so that's kind of what we're tracking at the state level at this point in time. And we use our local emergency managers to gauge that because they're locally in your communities. We're also working with all our state agencies. So certainly EGLE, which you've heard from. We're working with MDOT, DNR, and they're gathering their damage, that's state property as well, to add into this. We're working with Jeff and his team with the Army Corps of Engineers on various projects. So the comment I think you had made, or the statement is, you know, these processes, they seem like they take a long time. We've been working on them since last year. Now we just see a year later that we have more communities along the lakeshore that are impacted. So we're certainly aware of that. We're documenting that. We're sending all that information to our state partners as well as the governor's office. The funding issue outside of Public Act 390, unfortunately, there's not a lot of mechanisms in the state for funding for individual assistance. If we do get a declaration down the road based on damage and resources or the lack thereof, if we go to FEMA and we ask for a presidential, then they do have an individual assistance program, which I believe Randy had a document that was handed out that discusses that. That's only if FEMA gets involved. Now, we're talking with FEMA daily. FEMA is in our offices. They know what's going on in the state. They're also working with all our other states. And we're talking with Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. We're also talking to our Canadian partners, Ontario, because we're all dealing with the same thing, and we're all trying to document, see how big this is, and see what the best route for the state of Michigan is. But it's based on damage, unfortunately. So it's not proactive. Fortunately, it's reactive, and that's kind of just the way the law is written.
And as of 2 weeks ago, FEMA has stuck to their guns about a disaster has to have a defined beginning and a defined end, and they don't consider the rise of the lakes as a defined disaster.
Right.
We know it's a disaster. We all see it. Their definition of it under the Stafford Act, which is what they govern, which is the federal government's disaster program, doesn't see it that way. So far, we're still working on trying to convince people to change that.
So we focus on storms. Our winds, our storms, our rain events that are going to push water up on shore. So we work closely with the Weather Service who puts out those warnings. So by all means, please adhere to those warnings because it's a life safety issue. We don't want anybody caught in floodwaters if that water comes up out of the lake. So Randy has a picture of assets that are here within the county that can help with that. Any type of emergency disaster, life safety is always going to be number one, right? For the state police, our local troopers out of the post, our road patrol officers, deputies, our firefighters, right? They're going to respond immediately and assist in that. Emergency management, what Randy and I do, we have all those plans for those processes to work immediately, and then we work on that recovery aspect of it when things are being cleaned up. And again, unfortunately, it's based on damage, and that's what we have to document and calculate. So, who's been taking photos of their soil erosion, of their homes, storm after storm after storm? Please continue to do that. We don't know where this is going to go. Some folks aren't. This, again, we're talking just Huron County here, but we got other counties all along the lake that were saying the same thing. Our aviation unit flies the shorelines. We're seeing homes that we know have not reported to the local emergency management. We need that information, right? We have to build that case, right? We have to be put into a situation, and the best practice to do that is documentation, so we can go to that next level for a declaration potentially, and that will unlock, again, hopefully some economic doors here to help our communities out.
One of the things that we just had significant wind for the last 2 days. If that significant wind caused significant shore damage, significant structural damage to anything, we can define an event and circumvent the water level nonsense that we are fighting our heads against, and maybe get a declared event in that little bit of a time frame with that wind caused damage. So everything that you do at your house, we tell you, date and time, document, timestamp everything. If you want to send it to me, I'm collecting a file on all of the stuff. We need that stuff because we're trying to prove that just because this has taken 1.5 or 2 years to get to where we're at, or 5 years, and 3 more to get out of it, or 5 more to get out of it, or never get out of it, that this is a disaster. It's the same as Sandy hit New York and all that. It's the exact same thing for us. So we need your guys' help to document all that stuff, even if you just keep it yourself. Sir?
A question, you mentioned structure damages, okay? Until a porch falls in, it's not a disaster. So the erosion of shore doesn't count, the encroachment of water doesn't count, the loss of sidewalks does, the loss of stairways does, no. Where can we get the guidelines on what you need documentation on to help deal with your job?
Those guidelines are listed at the federal level in the Stafford Act. It's also listed in Public Act 390 or our Michigan Damage Assessment. And really, it's livable space. That's the damage that we have to go by is livable space.
We don't want to
outbuildings, docks, decks, shoreline. I know it's expensive.
We're not going to give you some rosy picture. Your vacation home is not what FEMA considers a livable structure. So just be aware, we're not going to sit here and tell you a story that you don't want to hear. Vacation homes are considered very different than the primary home you live in. Please understand that when you're reading this material. It's a very different thing. I'm not going to stand up here and promise something that's not going to happen. FEMA does not consider vacation homes as livable structures. It's got to be your primary residence, sir.
Do you think our property assessments will go down based on this?
We have had a lot of discussions about a lot of things, and one of the things that we've talked about is where people think that this isn't going to affect somebody who doesn't live on the shore. Well, guess what? It will. Your property assessments, your property values, obviously, are going to be affected by this, and rightfully so. You should be able to adjust those if it's your property is valuable, it's not as valuable because stuff is gone. You need to address that through your local tax commissions and see what happens. What does that do to everybody else that doesn't live on the shore? If that value goes down, that's tax money that's not coming in. It's going to affect police, fire, EMS, and everybody else, and all the other services that government provides. This is a problem for all of us. This is a problem for the farmers in our community, because it's like nothing's draining. The last year's planting season was a problem for everyone. I will say this, farm disasters for crop stuff is covered by the USDA. It's a completely different system. We are not even involved in that. It goes through the USDA. They determine all that stuff. So the farming thing. So if you see a farm disaster declared for that, it has nothing to do with this process. It's completely separate. And why? It's got to do with subject matter experts and some of the things over the course of the years and things. So when we start talking about disaster processes, you hear about people sending resolutions. A resolution is not a disaster declaration. A disaster declaration is a very finely worded piece of paper delineating this damage to your community that needs to be done and signed by a local official and then passed up the chain. Your local officials can do one in a village, a city, or a township, and then it goes to us at the county level. I compile them and I take them to the county board of commissioners, and then they decide whether it overwhelms our resources. And that's the key words to all this. It has to overwhelm our resources. And then we make a disaster declaration. If we are overwhelmed, we pass it up through the Emergency Management, Homeland Security Department, Michigan State Police, to the governor, and then it goes through another process. One of the key words in this that the lieutenant talked about here was damage assessment. Damage assessment just doesn't happen one time. So we have a problem here, I go out and do damage assessment. Tornado hit Owendale a few years ago. I went there, I did my damage assessment along with the Owendale people, and then you move on from there. Well, if that becomes too much for us and I send it to the state, then the state comes in and redoes another level of damage assessment. And then after that happens, then FEMA comes in and does it again. It happens at least three separate times, and each time, they can say, no, that doesn't rise to this, it doesn't rise to this, it doesn't rise to this, and you have enough resources to take care of this on your own. Why does it happen that way? Someplace along the line, somebody skewed the numbers and there became a need for it. Every time you say there ought to be a law, well, that's probably why, because somebody tried something that there should have been a law about. So it's a very complicated level of stuff. It doesn't mean you're going to get anything. Public assistance always comes first, always. So anytime there's a public infrastructure that's damaged, it always comes first. And then, until you get to the FEMA level, then we have some problems. The one thing I will mention this, we are in the middle of the county doing our hazardous mitigation plan. Through this hazardous mitigation plan process, we can actually apply for grants through the Army Corps and a bunch of other people to actually harden some of our public infrastructure, which may in turn help your drainage, help your other stuff too. So there are things that we can do, even though the federal government right now doesn't consider it, the Stafford Act applicable, the Army Corps and some of the things that they do might help us do some other things. The technical assistance they're talking about is already being applied across several places in the state of Michigan. We haven't had any request here for a lot of that yet. Obviously, sandbagging and some of the things for some of the folks in the audience, we're talking about that. We can arrange for that. I try to make those things as local as I can. So for instance, I would come back here to Ben in Caseville Township and say, hey, post one here. I go to Seawing when I know they're going to need help, post one there, because this whole part of the shoreline is flooding, and that sandbagging would actually work fairly well. The wave actions here aren't as miserable as they are for some of you folks. Obviously, out on the point, it's a whole other story. And over on the east side, there's some spots that are bad. So those things are going on all the time. So and we're talking about public versus private assistance. The last thing that I want to kind of get into is just because government can't do anything, and I use this term all the time and people kind of get a chuckle out of it, but things move at the speed of government, and we know how fast that moves. Anybody who ever served in the military, you completely understand how that moves. Hurry up and wait. Give me all the information you got, I want it tomorrow, but we'll get back to you on your assistance as we get to it. Moving at the speed of government. There are private agencies out there, the Red Cross, some other agencies. There's an agency, a thing called 211 where you can call if you're having trouble finding assistance financially and some other things, that we can point you in some directions where we can find somebody who can help you. If you can't get things done yourself, if you're overwhelmed, if you're just watching your property go by and it's driving you nuts and you don't know what else to do, there are things we can help you with, because the mental part of this is just as bad as the financial part.
Amen to that.
So there are agencies. If you call 211, they can point you in directions, and they're called voluntary agencies, VOADs as we call them in the business. And these people can help steer you in maybe directions where there are grants and funds available through private resources. Don't forget, there's never one way to do things, there's always more than one way. We will find something somehow to figure it out. I always say, we got each other's backs. We've got people here that I work with in Tuscola County, do the same thing I do in Saginaw County. They're all here. We all work together to find ways to do things. We sit down at the table and we start talking about what worked here, what worked there, what didn't work here, what didn't work there. Midland County floods all the time. The Midland County Emergency Manager is in our region, and I will see her on Monday, by the way. We sit down at the table, we talk about these things all the time. What can we do? How did it work? She went through the disaster process when Midland flooded a couple years ago on a rapid event, and they didn't get a third of what they really needed or what they really wanted, because that's the way that qualifies when you start doing damage assessment. So just don't give up, and don't think that we're just going to sit here and say, oh, you're on your own. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the constraints under the law that we have, but we'll find a way, and we're not going to give up about changing some of the things in the law. So you're talking about permits and some other things. Get your permits, and we'll see if we can help you. And I think the gist of what the Army Corps and Eagle and the Weather Service, everybody says, we're all working together to try. And that's all we can promise you is we're going to keep trying. Money is not sitting there for us right now, unfortunately. And that's the biggest thing that I wanted to make sure everybody walked out here with the truth. So the truth helps, because when you start the baseline of the truth, now we can work on solutions. So, and I'm all about, you give me something that worked at your property, and I will help somebody else see that and spread it around. So that's part of what we're opening up to questions for everybody. there's not a whole lot that we can tell you that's gonna make you feel any better about stuff, but like I said.
Shed any light on flood insurance versus erosion? Is there any out there? Or
That's,
You know, I'm not an expert in the National Flood Insurance Program or any flooding insurance, but that is generally your best mitigation, is flood insurance at the private level for that. Randy had mentioned there are some mitigation projects, but that's down the road and that's through our office at the federal level. So there were some documents. Randy will have some documents on his website as well that will give you further information on that might answer those questions.
Sir?
Back in the 70s, there were jetties and groins put out, you know, in front of the seawalls. Is that not allowed now, or?
That was probably, if it was the 70s, the Army Corps came in the 70s, and it was called Operation Foresight. That was a big project at the request of the state of Michigan from the governor for us to come in and provide engineering solutions. We did a bunch of things, like we built berms, we did the jetties, we put in seawalls, we did sand cribs, all kinds of good stuff all around the state. The thing with advanced measures is, that is something that falls under our direct assistance and Public Law 8499 authorities. We are proposing those to certain communities if we think that they might qualify for that. It's a long process. It's our last resort. But under technical assistance, we can come out and take a look and say, all right, this is your guys' problem area. Direct assistance isn't going to help you. What you need here is a berm around this entire area, and we'll pursue advanced measures, and that's something that would go starting with Randy, and then to Tim in the state, and it would go up from there. So is it in consideration? It is something that's in consideration.
You can request it through your township, your city, your village, and then through, we'll definitely look into it.
It's not a, hey, it's gonna be done tomorrow. We're talking about a year.
I've got jetties out in front of my house, and they were put in under, I got a permit from 1973.
Okay.
When the water was high.
Yeah.
And I understand that if you take them out, you're not allowed to put them back in.
That I don't know. That would, maybe Mark or Brian would have the answer to that. I don't know that. My side of the house is more the operations type stuff, so.
Excuse me, we're from Channel 5 WNEM TV News.
Sure.
We're trying to get some footage. If anybody got any pictures of their houses or anything, could you email them to us? Brian, if you could, the website address, could you jot it down for me, or I'll put it down a little later?
Sure.
Okay.
He's just from News 5. He was just looking for some pictures of shoreline stuff, if you have some stuff.
I would like to find out which one of you, or, because I can't remember which one of you was part Eagle.
Yep, that's me. It's Brian.
Okay. Can I be with you after? Because I have a very unique, totally different situation with High Road.
Yep, we can talk. I'm open to any other questions that, yeah.
Just a quick one regarding the jetties. I think maybe part of your question was, do jetties work in certain situations?
That's kind of what I was thinking too.
Yeah. Do they seem to help? Not that we can have them necessarily.
Yes, jetties do work in certain circumstances. The biggest issue with the jetty is on the updrift, you have littoral drift of sand going down the shoreline. The jetty interrupts that flow. So you get they call it a fillet that forms on the upstream side, updrift side of the jetty. Then you have erosion on the downstream side, downdrift side. There are ways to alleviate that, and that would be bringing in a few hundred cubic yards of sand to fill in the fillet to create the fillet, so that the drift just bypasses, and it's still the drift, the flow of water down the shoreline can only carry so much sand. If you deprive it, it's going to be able to pick it up. If it bypasses the jetty and can't pick up any more sand, then you're not going to have the degree of erosion on the downdrift side of it. We have issued a few permits recently, and so has Eagle, for new jetties. There is a long review process into it because we have to get the engineers in our hydraulics section looking at it to determine, to give us an idea of, do we need pre-fill here? If we do, how much? What is the appropriate length of the structure? So there's several things that go into it, and it's not a quick fix. It's something, if you want to consider it, after you do take care of the issue right now for preparing for the next few years.
Yeah, let me add on to that. Everybody thinks, when you think of a jetty or a groin, think of a large, one size, straight out, all one height, typically above the water. The groins that we issue now, when we do issue them, are a step-down design. So they'll start at maybe 2.5 foot tall, and they'll actually taper down below the water level. So one of the things about groins that you've got to be cautious with and mark in on this is that's the kind of thing that might help you and then ends up hurting the people down shore. So we've changed the design. Yes, we have issued some. They work in some places, but there's a lot to consider. You can't put them too close together. You can't put them too far out. Engineers at Coral look at that too.
So you are letting us rebuild them? Can you rebuild the?
There are circumstances where we've issued permits, but they're not the same as what is typical. Like if you drive down Lexington, if you've ever driven down there, you'll see row after row of them, and they're all about, probably this high if you're standing on the bottom. No, there's a different design that we've issued.
But you can, now I got a customer that has them. Can you rebuild them?
To re-encase something?
Just to fill them back in over the years if...
Depends on how much is left.
A lot of what they're talking about are cedar posts, okay?
Yeah.
Like cedar post structures in the lake that were used to break the waves as they were coming in and take the energy out of them, so when they got to the shoreline it wasn't as much. There was also a thought that they might hold some of the sand in towards the shoreline as the wave receded. So they're not talking about a big steel dike type thing going out into the lake.
They're little T's.
Yeah, they're little T sections of.
Yeah, we've evaluated those, and we're typically not reissuing T structures like that. I don't think the Corps is either.
If you haven't seen them, you haven't been out on the shoreline.
Or on the shoreline, you can see them. You can see them.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Well, mainly from Port Austin to the east, you can see them all over.
All up and down Sandpoint too.
Yeah, there's a few, but not quite as many as we. Any other questions that we have?
Is there any sort of plan in place for M25 running through Quantica Sea? Because if the water rises as much.
Is Steve Anderson still in the back? Steve Anderson's the emergency management coordinator for Tuscola. He can answer that probably better than I can. She's got a question about 25 at Quantica Sea. Right next to you there.
If the water level rises between a foot and a foot and a half, a lot of that will just be underwater. And there's a area where it runs back behind it, so you can't really make a wall there. So what would the plan be for that?
So the temporary plan would be like it was when it was in construction for the bridge. So if I had to detour all the way down to 138 and walking around.
Everyone knows that 25 in Sanilac County has already been rebuilt, right?
What's that?
M25 in Sanilac County has already had to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
So it is affecting the lake, the roads around the lake. I want to point out one thing since we mentioned Quantica Sea, and we mentioned a little bit about our sign up here. This is the Sheriff's Department's rolling stock, as we call it. This is all the emergency management rescue equipment the sheriff has. So if you want to know what we have planned or what we can do in case someone does get stranded out in the water, or if our neighbors in our other counties around us get stranded out in the water, you need to take a look at that sign. We've got multiple boats. We've got airboats, shallow draft. We've got vehicles that will float in the water, with wheels on, without wheels. We spent a lot of time and effort with the sheriff over a lot of years getting all these things into place. They practice all the time. Our dive teams work together with the counties around us. So if you're worried about those type of things, we do have a lot of experience in place and a lot of equipment in place to help out with those things. And the sheriff is here. If you ever have a question about that, he'd be happy to answer it for you. But those things have been, this is well before we even have water issues. We've had this in place to do ice rescues and water rescues and all these other things that we do. Interior and exterior of the county. You could be on the river, you can be anyplace else. So we do have things in place and plans in place to expedite those things. So we can help out on some levels. Any other further questions? Sir?
Steel seawalls versus plastic. Do you approve either one?
Yep.
Or is one better than the other?
Probably, but I'm not an expert on which is which.
I think it really depends on the where you are located. A vinyl wall, plastic wall, probably would work better in the canal system out on Sandpoint. I don't know how well they would handle some of the waves we get on the north side of Sandpoint. You know, and I can't envision them lasting well, but that's my personal opinion.
What about cost? Do you know anything about the difference in cost?
I don't know anything
One thing,
about cost.
let's do this. I know there's several contractors in the room. If you want to raise your hand, who's the contractors that are in the room, please? And there's one behind you here, sir, too. If you're, please feel free to, they would be the guys to ask. They'll give you, we'll call it free estimate day inside the room.
What about today's technology? We see all these cameras in here. Are they useful or not?
For submitting applications?
Yes.
Yes, sir. You have to submit them online, so they're great for that.
All right.
You bet.
It's gone so long, I forgot all the rest of my questions.
That leads me to, if there's no more actual questions, we'll kind of wrap things up, but it does lead me to this. My card is up here. If you have questions of any kind, go ahead, sir. I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead. Here? Men's chairs, Mike.
The Huron County, like they did back in 1984, they're going to pass out sandbags, places to get sand, because down there by Mud Creek, it's going to be underwater this year.
I have a very limited number of sandbags that I was able to get through back from 1986 on forward. And I do have some that you can have. And I've got about 11,000 that are available that are for here or there. And I know I've given some to the Rose Island residents and a few here in Caseville. And when I run out, then that's that. Then the county has to purchase them from the Army Corps. No, we're not able to provide the sand. One of the things that's a problematic, to answer his question, government has a very limited ability to take government money and spend it on private property. Very limited, very, very limited. And it's extraordinarily narrow scope to do that. So we can give out certain things, like if I have sandbags that I was able to procure, we can hand out some of those, but we can't pay for improvements to private property. They frown on that, and then you end up with Bernie Madoff as Christmas.
And Randy, real quick, sure. Just real quick, he mentioned that once he's out, he has to purchase them from the Corps. That's correct. Again, that is only for critical public infrastructure. It's not for private use. I just want to clarify that.
Thought of another question that I had. We were maybe fortunate, but we lost our seawall in that 87, 88 period, and we had reinstalled it and we put a crib out in front of it. Are you approving those?
Rock cribs are used quite a bit on the other side of the bay.
And yes, we are approving them.
My home is on Sandpoint.
Yeah, we approve.
You're still doing those?
Yes, sir.
Is that a good idea?
Works great in certain circumstances, yeah.
Again, my card's up here. If you have any questions, email them to me. That's the best way to get a hold of me, is through email most of the time, because I'm obviously gone a lot. And you can contact us anytime, we'll get your answers.
Thank you.
Yeah.